Dear students, welcome to week 6 module 2, UN Secretary General's report on In Larger Freedom of 2005 will be subject matter of this module. Before we go further, let us see the historical context in which this effort was made. As you know, in 2000, in the Millennium Summit, the world leaders have adopted a Millennium Declaration and a plan of action, and they identified specific goals which must be achieved by the year 2015. These include halving extreme poverty or addressing gender discrimination, addressing health, and a range of other issues. Now, the then Secretary General of United Nations, Mr. Boutros Ghali, set up a high-level panel on threats, challenges, and change, which submitted a report in the year 2003 indicating a number of reforms. And these reforms include reform of the UN human rights machinery, particularly the Commission on Human Rights. In fact, this high-level panel suggested that the membership of the UN Commission on Human Rights should be expanded to include all countries of the world. And it also recommended that the countries should nominate persons of high stature as the leaders of their human rights delegation. And in addition, one of the recommendations was that the High Commissioner for Human Rights must bring out an annual report on the status of human rights worldwide. It's a very important recommendation indeed. And it also asked that the office of the High Commissioner should be significantly strengthened, and that a 15-member advisory council be constituted to assist the Commission on Human Rights, and these independent experts should be persons of high stature, expertise, and eminence. Now, this 2003 high-level panel report is also a basis. Now, all this form the historical context for the UN General Assembly Summit, which was held in the year 2005. In many ways, this 2005 UNGA Summit was a watershed moment in the history of mankind, with several path-breaking decisions having been adopted in that summit. Before that summit, the UN Secretary General, Mr. Kofi Annan, gave a report in April to the for the consideration of the UN General Assembly, and that report is titled In Larger Freedom Towards Development, Security, and Human Rights for All. Now, if you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights preamble, there is an aspirational goal mentioned at the end of the preamble, namely in larger freedom. So, it therefore very interesting to see that the UN Secretary General's report is titled as In Larger Freedom. And as you know, the primary aims of the United Nations are to foster international peace and security, to secure economic, social development. And in this report, there is a categorical affirmation that you cannot have security without human rights. You cannot have human rights, you cannot have peace and security without development, and you cannot have development without security. You cannot have either of these without human rights. In other words, human rights was recognized as the third most important pillar in the UN efforts. So, and a decision was taken to double the budget of the UN human rights machinery. So, it is very important. So, there is a clear recognition or a clear assertion that human rights is as important as peace and security, and that it is the third important pillar on which the UN efforts must be based. So, this is the context, and in this report a number of reforms have been suggested. These include reforms relating to development, these include reform relating to terrorism, these include reforms relating to human rights. So, we will now look at one by one. In fact, development is intrinsically related to human rights. So, poverty is again intrinsically related to human rights. In fact, poverty is a negation of human rights. It is both a cause of human rights violation and it is also a consequence of human rights violation. And in this 2005 report submitted by UN Secretary General, there was a recommendation that there should be 50 billion per annum fund be created for fighting poverty by all countries, and countries should take systemic efforts to see that the MDG goal of reducing by half the extreme poverty should be taken. These include preparation of national plans to achieve MDGs. These include immediate steps, immediate initiatives to move towards education, health care, anti-malaria efforts. And as far as development is concerned, it was also recognized that innovative sources of funding for development should be recognized and they should be tapped, and there should also be efforts for trade liberalization. Any efforts to reduce poverty, any efforts to move towards health and education will have concrete gains insofar as human rights are concerned. Now, let us come to terrorism. You all know that terrorism is a serious human rights violation. In fact, the link between terrorism and human rights is twofold. A terrorist killing is itself a human rights violation. B, the way states go in attacking terrorism can also contribute to a human rights violation if the states do racial profiling, if the states do surveillance, if the states do violate right to privacy by way of arbitrary interception with emails, with communications on the grounds of national security, there could be violation. If the states carry out targeted killings through drones, through assassinations of terrorist leaders, they can also involve violation of right to life. Or if they in the war on terror or in the so-called war on terror, if some innocents were picked up, or if persons of a particular religious denomination were targeted, it could mean a human rights violation. So, there is an important link between terrorism on the one hand and human rights on the other. Now, the 2005 report submitted by Kofi Annan mentioned about the terrorism. It condemned terrorism in all forms and manifestations by whosoever committed for whatever reasons, regardless of the underlying ideological or other motives. So, you find that there is an unequivocal or a strong condemnation of terrorism in all its forms and manifestations, and there is a recommendation to the member states of United Nations to move towards the evolution or the preparation of a comprehensive convention to deal with terrorism. Of course, even today the comprehensive convention on terrorism is still a long way to go. States have not still agreed on a definition of terrorism. Now, there was another recommendation urging states to go for a comprehensive effort on nuclear terrorism, and also there should be a strategy to address the issue of terrorism, insofar as countries which are transiting from war to peace, those who are moving from war to rule of law societies. It was recognized that there should be a peace building commission should be established to support these efforts, and there should be a peace building fund should be created. Now, let me come to an extremely important doctrine that was adopted. It is called responsibility to protect doctrine. Generally, there is a state sovereignty is a cardinal principle. In other words, a state is supreme. It can do whatever and in its own jurisdiction. Now, in this report, there is an assertion that sovereignty entails responsibility to protect one's own populations from such horrors as genocide, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. So, and if a country does not fulfill its obligation to protect its population from these serious crimes, this responsibility will move on to the international community, which will act in close collaboration with the UN Security Council through a joint action to see that the human rights are protected. So, this is extremely important doctrine that was adopted, and it's R2P. It is called in short R2P doctrine. There are attempts now to operationalize this doctrine by member states of the United Nations, by the civil society, by the UN itself. Now, let us come to other major goals or major outcomes. If you see the Boutros Ghali's high-level panel, they recommended strengthening the office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and that high-level panel had two options: either to reform the Commission on Human Rights or replace it with a much more effective body. And this high-level panel went in for a reform of the Commission of Human Rights. On the other hand, the Secretary General, the following Secretary General, Kofi Annan, went further. What the high-level panel thought will be a long-term option, he suggested that the Commission on Human Rights, which was subjected by politicization, which was subjected by allegations of double standards, which had many other loopholes. So, he suggested replacing this Commission on Human Rights with a Human Rights Council. And the report in Larger Freedom has also mentioned the composition of the Human Rights Council, its place in the entire UN setup. So, this is a paradigm shift. For example, under the Commission on Human Rights system, under a number of UN treaties, a number of binding, non-binding standards have been evolved. For the first time, you see a paradigm shift from standard setting or from treaty adoption to the implementation or enforcement, and a stronger body which can meet more often than the predecessor body, which can take swift action, which can take with a more clearer ambit, with more mechanisms like universal periodic review, and where only the earlier on it was the small and medium countries would be end up as a targets of the Commission's efforts. But under the universal periodic review, all countries whether they be big and mighty, whether they could be permanent members of the Security Council, everyone, regardless of their security, military might or economic power, will be subject to the Human Rights Council's jurisdiction, and their human rights record will be checked. Now, these are in some significant reform measures which were mentioned in the UN Secretary General's report in larger freedom, and the report is also called Towards Development and Security and Human Rights for All. A very important aspiration indeed, development, security and human rights for all. So, there is a these reforms of the UN human rights machinery have led to certain improvements in the past decade, and of course, still there are challenges and there are many crises, humanitarian and human rights crisis. Still the world has a long way to go, but and 2005 summit marked a major beginning or a major milestone in the efforts to reform the UN human rights machinery.